What I want to do is just spend a few minutes describing sort of the fundamentals around what the challenges and opportunities are in terms of using registries to support clinical and translational research. So I'm a big believer in truth in lending, so I'm going to give you a little bit of roadmap of what I want to try to convey in the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes. The first part is really going to be about something that's probably very well understood by this audience, but I still think it's important to sort of revisit the fundamental drivers for this type of work, which is that, if anything, we're sort of swimming in a sea of data when we try to conduct clinical and translational research. And one of the challenges therein is, how do we make sense of that data? How do we organize it? How do we get it back to the point where we can analyze it and generate insights from it? And this is really driven by what is a growing body of present and emergent data resources, and I'll get into some details there. And then I'm going to talk about four really important considerations that I think drive the design and use of registries for clinical and translational research. I'll start out by just sort of level setting around what is a registry and perhaps what is not. I'm going to talk about some of the technical and design challenges, although I think it was Kim that said to me she often feels like she needs a translator when I speak. I'm going to try to present this without any need for translation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the role that all of you in this room play when we talk about registries, which is enabling knowledge workers to access data, sort of disintermediating the data so there's fewer steps between where the data is generated and where people can access it and start asking and answering questions. And then finally, I'm going to round out and talk about what your role is, because building these registries and rolling them out to support clinical and translational research requires what is sort of in a very sort of simple way a team sport. Right? There is the informatics team, there is the regulatory dimension, there are the operational dimensions, and then there's the role that you, as the stakeholders who wish to use these registries, play in terms of defining them and helping us understand how to deliver that data in usable ways. And then finally, I'll just sort of wrap things up by talking a little bit about the data sciences cluster within the CCTS, which is really sort of the home for this type of work, and give you a little bit of direction in terms of how to access the resources of that cluster, which are sort of central to using these sorts of registries. So with that as sort of a roadmap, let's revisit first sort of the fundamentals of translational science and what they mean when we start talking about data and data management. So lots of people like to talk about translational science as being from the bench to the bedside. I, being an informatician, prefer to refer to it as from the lab to the laptop. So this is really about sort of getting discovery out of the lab and to the point at which it's actionable, perhaps to influence a patient or a population. And this is really about creating this sort of continuous and virtuous cycle between knowledge generation, right, that might happen in basic or clinical research, and the application of that knowledge at the clinical or population levels, and importantly, feeding back that information from the clinical and population levels to that driving research that gives us new evidence. There's a lot of common informatics or data management needs that pervade this cycle from basic to clinical to practice. And they include these fundamentals, like how do we even collect and manage all this data in a way that it's reusable and structured and of high quality? How do we integrate data, right? Frequently we're talking about data at multiple scales. Maybe we want to bring in data from linked public data sets outside of our organization. We want to use data from the EHR. Maybe we want to use data that's generated from various biomolecular instruments. How do we bring that all together? How do we engage in knowledge management? This is about how do we understand our data so that it is in fact reusable time and time again. There are a lot of sort of humorous cartoons out there on the internet about the challenge of sharing data in the scientific domain, and the fundamental here is if we don't understand our data at sort of a systematic level, it's highly likely that when someone says, let's revisit that data set, you'll be looking at a spreadsheet or a database and wondering, why did I even name it this? What does that mean? What is the content of this data repository? There are other fundamental issues around information delivery. How do we bring that data back to end users like the people in this room so that they can actually act upon it? And one of the things I like to say, and it's maybe a little bit shocking when you think about what I do for a living, is that computers are dumb literal machines, right? They can only do what we tell them to do. Human beings have unique and very powerful strengths in terms of pattern recognition and matching and understanding of sort of higher order sort of motifs in data sets. And so that means we need to actually deliver data back to people in a way that they can use those cognitive strengths to discover those interesting interrelationships between the data. And then finally, how do we provide for advanced analytics? Increasingly, as the size of these data sets gets broader and broader, traditional statistical methods don't necessarily give us the sorts of answers that we need. So we need to use other types of tools like machine learning or cluster analysis and sort of these advanced analytical methods that allow us to discover patterns in data sets that maybe a traditional statistical design might not elucidate. And so these are just a few of many challenges. And so when we start talking about translational science and informatics and data management and really the role of registries, we really start digging into almost every one of these dimensions that I've outlined here. For those of you that are big fans of sort of the nomenclature in clinical and translational science, this really comes back to, in many ways, those foundational T1 and T2 blockages. And I will argue that in particular, when we talk about registries, we're talking about that T2 blockage, right? How do we break down barriers between the clinic and research? This drive for translational science and sort of the need to address these fundamental data management and informatics issues is really, in my mind's eye, catalyzed by two critical factors. The first is something I don't think anyone in this room is not familiar with, which is the extending timeline that is associated with getting new therapies from discovery to practice, right? I don't think, and maybe I could be mistaken, that anyone in this room considers it acceptable that it could take anywhere, depending on the application area, from 15 to 20 years to get a discovery out of the lab and into the clinic, right? And then secondly, there is this sort of data tsunami facing the life sciences, and that goes back to that sort of swimming or perhaps drowning in a sea of data, as I alluded to. Because as we start engaging in more advanced research designs and perhaps, say, bring genomic technology to bear alongside the data we get out of electronic health records, the volume, the scope, the variability of the data that we're looking at is massive. And so how do we organize all that in a way that we can act upon it? As I've already alluded to, these sources of data are ever expanding in biomedicine. There are sort of typical systems that we might encounter in the clinical environment, such as our enterprise systems. You may have interacted with some of these, our electronic health records, clinical research management systems, various data warehouses. And I always tell people we mistakenly refer to data warehouses as a singular. I rarely have encountered an academic health center where there is but one data warehouse, and they exist at many different scales. And then there's any number of emergent sources, right? Personal health records, molecular phenotyping, environmental data, sensor technologies, right? How many people have a Fitbit on them today? Anyone? Am I the only one? I'm wearing one. Okay, so, you know, that's just an example. How many people have a smartphone? That's an easier question, right? Everyone has, I mean, I would be shocked. If you don't, maybe we should talk after this is over. Nonetheless, you know, this is a massive source of data. You know, everything from activity to social behavioral data, et cetera, that can be brought together with electronic health record or perhaps with environmental factors. You know, I've been involved in a project most recently where we've been looking at the correlation between a unique clinical decision support system that helps patients and providers talk about cardiovascular disease risk. And we've been trying to connect that with socio-demographic data outside of the university to understand how the backgrounds of our patients influence things like medication compliance or likelihood that they will be diagnosed and treated early for what are modifiable risk factors that could lead to more advanced cardiovascular risk disease. It is incredibly hard to do that, right? To actually connect the dots between, say, census data, other linked open data sets, and data from our electronic health record, that is a fundamental challenge. It sounds at a surface form like it should be very easy, but practically speaking is very challenging. And these are some of the areas that we can tackle by using rigorously designed registries, as we're going to talk about today. Ultimately, this is about leveraging data as a strategic asset. This is a big, scary diagram, but the takeaway from this diagram is we're trying to get to the point where we're constantly looking at the environment in which we conduct clinical care or research and trying to identify how do we instrument that environment, get data out of it, structure it in a way that's sensible, and then deliver it back to people that are going to make decisions spanning a spectrum from policy to research to practice. And you have to keep in mind that this is a highly synergistic cycle. And if you were to summarize this diagram in a very simplistic way, I would tell you that right now our traditional way of thinking about data in the clinical or in the research environment is we treat it as though it's a depletable asset, right? As though every time we use data, it diminishes in value. Well, it's not. Data is a renewable asset. In fact, every time we use data and we understand it and we engage in quality control or analyses, the data gets better. Right? So data improves over time as it's used. And so therefore, this idea of leveraging data as a strategic asset, sort of creating what we in the informatics community might refer to as data liquidity, where data is accessible to people who want to act upon it for very strategic purposes and generate value, that is what the use of registries is all about, right? It's empowering knowledge workers to get to that end point. So now let's get into the specifics of building registries. So to level set, I wanted to talk about sort of how we might define a registry. This will be, I promise you, the only slide that I will read verbatim, but I think it's worthwhile just for us to say this, in that a registry is an organized system that uses observational study methods to collect uniform data to evaluate specified outcomes for a population that we can define by a particular disease, condition, or exposure, right? So this is about getting the data we already have as it aligns to cohorts that we can define based upon disease or an outcome of interest, and structuring that data so that we can use it in important and interesting ways. And if you really want to get into sort of the details on this, there's some excellent publications, one of which is linked here, especially from AHRQ, that deal with some of these definitional aspects of how we engage in the best practices of establishing registries. Now, registries don't exist by themselves. They actually exist within a broader analytical environment that defines the research and clinical care sort of enterprise. And I wanted to lay out a couple other key definitions that you might encounter during the course of designing and using a registry, right? So you might hear people talk about BI or business intelligence, and this is really about how we generate insights from data regardless of where it comes from. And this can hit all of the mission areas that we might encounter in an academic health center, from clinical care to research to education to operations. Really, a subset of that is sort of the operational analytics side of the world, which is really how we understand the environment in which our health system is existing, right? And this is everything from cost to quality to outcomes metrics that make sense to us when we're trying to optimize the delivery of care. And this often exists in parallel to research analytics, which is where we start getting into how do we ask and answer innovative questions that maybe are outside of the current scope of knowledge that inform operational analytics. But when I say these are parallel, I say that because there's often integration between them. I can't tell you the number of times that someone comes to me and says, I want to build a registry or look at a project where I'm going to study a particular outcome in a cohort of patients with a disease of interest. And the reality is that some of the questions that they want to ask are very, very research specific and require custom development of the tools to extract that data from the electronic health record or other resources. But many of those questions often overlap with the activities of our colleagues in patient quality and safety or in the business intelligence side of the organization. And so we can synergistically work across those areas and bring together that data. So I think it's important when I sort of put this diagram up there to think about the fact that when we design registries, when we talk about using this observational data that we're already generating during the course of clinical or other sort of activities, that there is often tight coupling between these sort of operational and research analytics needs, and we need to be cognizant of that. And then underlying all of this, the ability to deliver business intelligence, whether it be operational or research or otherwise, requires us to have all sorts of technical infrastructure. And I will not sort of belabor the point because we could go deep into the weeds on that and it wouldn't be that exciting. Suffice it to say that this is not a trivial problem. It's not easy to get data out of the electronic health record. It's not easy to get it into discrete and actionable form. And that's the nature of the work that we're going to talk about during the course of this session today. Ultimately, designing a registry requires us to think about what are really combined use scenarios, right, where clinical care intersects with research. And this is about creating these dynamic and interoperable and flexible data platforms that support both areas, going back to the sort of big analytics model that I just laid out. And when we think about that, we have to think about the technologies that we use. How do we lower barriers to adoption? We don't have infinite resources to throw at these problems. We don't have infinite time, so we need to figure out how do we use the technologies that we might already have at the clinical endpoint and combine that with research-specific data management tools so that we can achieve some level of efficiency, right? This is about lowering barriers to adoption, right? If we had to build everything like it was brand new and we ignored all the technologies we had, it would be far too costly and far too difficult to put a registry into place. The second is that when we build a registry, we're often thinking about how are we going to share that data, which means we have to be very mindful of things like vocabularies and semantics. And this is really about making sure that we use a common language to define the data, a common data model, that we ensure if we're going to share this data with other organizations or across multiple research projects, that we're thinking ahead and not just building a data set for the here and now, but something that's durable and reusable over time, right? Because if you're going to put the time and energy into this, you're going to want to be able to integrate it with future data sets. You're going to want to be able to share data with other colleagues and collaborators. And so that requires a little bit of upfront work. And I'll tell you, this particular area is one of the sort of key pain points when we intersect with specific research groups that want to build registries, right? We'll say, you know, we need to spend some time selecting a data model and mapping your data set to these common terminologies. And the value proposition up front to someone that just wants to get their data out and use it to conduct an analysis doesn't seem readily apparent. And we get a lot of responses which are, why are we spending so much time on these data modeling and terminology issues? Why can't you just get me my data set so I can put it into Excel or into SAS or SPSS or Stata or whatever you're going to do or R and do my statistical analyses? And our answer is, well, that's really treating the data as a one-time only sort of tool. But it's unlikely that there aren't more questions that you can ask from that data set. So spending some time up front to do that modeling, to select those terminologies, to be very thoughtful, gives us that sort of runway to get to the point where that data becomes reusable and it becomes that strategic and renewable asset that I alluded to before. And then finally, we have to think about, from a design standpoint, how do we empower knowledge workers, right? How do we give the people, like those of you in this room, the ability to interact with data directly and solve real-world problems, right? Because if it always requires someone like myself or in the Department of Biomedical Informatics or in our data sciences cluster in the CCTS to help you as a human intermediary with your data, then it's unlikely that you're going to be able to ask and answer all the questions relative to that data set that you want to in a timely and efficient manner, right? We need to give you the tools to be able to intuitively interact with that data so that you are able to ask and answer those questions yourself. And if we can balance amongst all three of these major design considerations, we have a likely ability to deliver a successful registry platform. So when we work with individual groups to build registries, and when you see some of the technologies that we have to offer today, we're constantly seeking to balance between these technology issues, these data sharing issues, and these abilities to empower knowledge workers. I'd also point out that when we talk about, and I feel like I'm probably belaboring the point, but I think it's nonetheless important, but when we talk about sort of this selection of terminologies and data models, it also requires, when we're being thoughtful, to sort of balance between sort of the desire of building a perfect solution in which we can share with any possible user, that we can integrate with any possible other data set, versus picking something that's sort of a say, project-specific working level of interoperability. And suffice it to say, that's very hard, but it impacts everything from governance to the technologies we use to how we build the registry. And so I would encourage you to think, when we talk about the importance of data modeling and of selecting the right terminologies to describe your data, another critical issue is thinking about how do we balance between this ideal end state versus that which gives us a workable solution. And to give you sort of a glimpse of what I'm trying to get at, in the cancer community for close to almost 2 decades, there was substantial work to build a national data sharing infrastructure that was predicated on this idea that we'll model every data element and everybody in the country will use the same set of terminologies every single time that they integrate and share that data. Ultimately, that project failed because of that sort of single-mindedness that everybody had to do everything the same way every time. It wasn't that the standards weren't important, it's just that they weren't applied in a flexible and sort of intelligent way. And sort of the lesson learned there is that working interoperability, sort of achieving these standards and data models that make sense for an immediate project and give us the ability over time to interoperate with other data sets, is probably more important than this ideal end state of what we often call computable interoperability, where everything is perfectly modeled up front for sort of perpetuity. I'd also point out that building these sorts of platforms is a team sport, as I talked about before, right? It requires us to link expertise and capabilities from the computer science arena with what we do in biomedical informatics, and then with our colleagues in information technology, right? And this is about taking these foundational sort of theories and methods, which might not be very interesting to you, but are absolutely critical to the design and operation and achieving that balance that I talked about before in terms of the design of a registry, connecting it with these motivating problems. What are we trying to solve? Why are we collecting this data? What types of questions are we trying to ask and answer? And then ultimately delivering that in something that's scalable and cost-effective at a technology standpoint. And doing that actually requires us, and this is sort of an overlay of available technologies and sort of the traditional research project life cycle, requires us, going back to that sort of synergizing argument I made before, to be aware of what are the general technologies that we have that will actually support the design and operation of these registries. What are the technologies that are research specific, right? So for example, what data do we have in the electronic health record? What are we collecting in a research specific data management system like REDCap or one of our clinical research management systems? What data exists in the public domain that's already been collected and curated in various ways? So when we start thinking about that data modeling and that functional profile of registry, we have to be aware of all of these pieces, because what we want to do when we build a registry is sort of provide the glue, right, link between these various resources, which is one of the most important dimensions of this design process, understanding what data we already have, what tools we already have that can contribute to the design and operation of this registry. And ultimately, this is about giving knowledge workers, people like yourself, the ability to interact with that data, to take these driving problems, to take these end-user accessible analytical tools and generate these solutions, right? And it requires us to be very cognizant of the workflows. How are you going to ask and answer those questions? We actually have to take knowledge engineering efforts, those areas that I alluded to before, where we think about data models and standards, and couple them to those real-world driving problems so we achieve that working interoperability that I talked about before. And then finally, we have to think about all the people that are involved, right? There are clinicians and basic scientists and informaticians and statisticians, and each one of them will have a different sort of profile of how they want to interact with data. As I often tell people, we spend a lot of time, and this is probably a little bit heretical for me to say this, but we often say to people, you know, what do we need to make the principal investigators happy, right? I'm one of those people, right? It turns out that the principal investigators in many programs are not the people that are going to interact with the data, right? They're rarely the people entering or extracting or analyzing the data. We need to talk to the data managers and the statisticians and the research staff and the students and many others who are actually going to be hands-on with the data, because those are the people who likely need the workflow support that the registry is designed for. So that's yet another important consideration as we move forward. Not to take away, I'm sure there's some PIs that actively interact with their data, but I would argue that's the exception rather than the norm. So with that, I just want to round out before I hand things over to Peter to go into more detail on what we are here to talk about today, that the work that this Tools of the Trade session is predicated on is part of a broader grouping within the CCTS, which we call our data sciences cluster, right? And it combines dimensions of biostatistics and study design and informatics. It leverages other capabilities from the CCTS and the administrative dimensions, regulatory and ethics, participant recruitment, to bring together really a multidisciplinary approach to all of the data-centric problems that many of you will encounter on a day-to-day basis. And this is the team that's going to help you if you move forward with the registry project to be able to implement your vision for building this reusable registry. So I just want to sort of remind you all that, you know, we're here to provide this sort of one-stop shopping to be able to access all of these great resources and capabilities and expertise within the CCTS. We've designed this cluster to make it easy for you, so you don't have to talk to all of these individuals sort of in a sort of one-off manner, but instead we can consult with you in sort of a multidisciplinary manner. And we really want to make sure that this is as quick and facile as possible so that you can get the tools and solutions that you need to drive your research. So if you need the help of the data sciences cluster, and you'll hear more about it throughout the day today, the first step is either to come in through our web-based mechanisms, and Peter will talk to you more about how you do that, or to contact the CCTS staff, and they will connect you with one of us. And we have a variety of mechanisms, including research clinics, in-person consultations, various other sort of mechanisms to help you plan your project. So keep in mind, we can help you to navigate all these dimensions, from how you design your study to how you address regulatory issues to how you actually implement these sorts of technical solutions to your needs. So today's meeting, for the remainder of the day, you're going to hear more from Peter about sort of where we're at in terms of the design and function of the registry platforms that the CCTS has been establishing. And you'll actually get a little bit more sort of deep in the proverbial weeds as to how these tools work and what the next steps will be for you if you wanted to move forward with a collaboration with our data sciences cluster in order to implement this type of registry. So I'll leave you with a few quotes that I think are emblematic of what is possible when we implement these types of registries. But I will remind you, and I think this goes back to what we do in terms of the implementation science and sort of the translational nature of the CCTS, in terms of that final quote, that just the fact that we're building these registries and that we're evaluating these outcomes in new and interesting ways is in fact a form of research unto itself, right? And that the act of measuring these data points serves as an intervention, right? Because we're actually operating in a very dynamic and complex system. So this is my email address if anyone has any questions that you want to email me offline. I guess if there's any burning questions, I could take one or two before we transition and Peter takes over, or I could just stop talking and you can focus on your coffee. Any questions? I've stunned you all into silence. All right, so I will hand it over to Peter to talk a little bit more about our registry platforms.